We are here with our second ever Five Live. We are here in celebration of Valentine's Day. And because we are here for Valentine's Day, we will be reading love poems. Love poems, I would say, of the rich and famous, but these are poets. So maybe a little bit of fame once in a while, but no real riches. Now, because it is Valentine's Day, because these are love poems, I have to come out and tell you, first off, straight up, flat out, I do not believe in love. So, take that for what you will. We are here on a channel that does celebrate the art of fiction. So, that is what it is. That will be what it were. I have four separate poets, which means that I have two poems from one artist. Where should we begin? Well, if you said, ask yourself, where would you begin? Where should we begin? Where would a discussion of love poetry begin? Of course, if you said Emily Dickinson, you are absolutely correct. In a poem titled Awake, Ye Muses Nine, Sing Me a Strain Divine, or Oh, the Earth Was Made for Lovers, depending on who you find titling it. It was written in Valentine Week of 1850. This is the very first poem from Emily Dickinson that we have in her collected poems, supposedly set up in the order in which they were written. So this would be chronologically the very first Emily Dickinson poem. Awake, ye muses nine, sing me a strain divine. Unwind the solemn unwind the solemn twine, and tie my Valentine. Oh, the earth was made for lovers, for damsel and hopeless swain, for sighing and gentle whispering, for unity made of twain. All things do go according in earth or sea or air. God hath made nothing single but thee in his world so fair. The bride and the bridegroom, the two, and then the one. Adam and Eve, his consort, the moon, then the sun. The life doth prove the precept. Who obey shall happy be. Who will not serve the sovereign be hanged on fatal tree. The high do not seek the lowly, the great do seek the small. None cannot find who seeketh on this terrestrial ball. The bee doth court the flower his suit receives, and they make merry wedding whose guests are 100 leaves. The wind doth woo the branches they are one, and father fond demandeth the maiden for his son. The storm doth walk the seashore, humming a mournful tune. The wave with eye so pensive looketh to see the moon. Their spirits meet together, they make the solemn vows. No more he singeth mournful her sadness she doth lose. The worm doth woo the mortal, death claims a living bride. Night unto day is married, morn unto eventide. Earth is a merry damsel, and heaven a knight so true. And earth is quite coquettish, and beseemeth in vain to sue. To bringing thee to justice, and marshalling thy soul. Thou art a human solo, a being cold and lone. Wilt have no kind companion, thou reap'st what thou hast sown. Hast never silent hours and minutes all too long, and deal of sad reflection and wailing instead of song. There's Sarah and Eliza and Emmeline so fair, and Harriet and Susan and she with the curling hair. Thine eyes are sadly blinded, but yet thou mayest see 6 true and comely maidens sitting upon the tree. Approach that tree with caution, then up it boldly climb, and seize the one thou lovest, nor care for space or time. Then bear her to the greenwood, and build for her a bower, and give her what she asketh, jewel or bird or flower, and bring the life and trumpet, and beat upon the drum, and bid the world good morrow, and go to glory home. The very first Emily Dickinson poem that we think we have access to. The next poem I will read comes to us from John Donne, and it is maybe a love poem. It is maybe a poem of making love. It is maybe a Hubba Hubba poem. It is titled The Flea. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. Me it sucked first, and now sucks thee. And in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Confess it, this cannot be said, a sin, or shame, or loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood, made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Oh, stay, 3 lives in this one flea spare, where we almost nay more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed, and marriage temple is. Through parents' grudge and you we are met, and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though yous make you apt to kill me, let not this self-murder added be, and sacrilege 3 sins in killing 3. Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence? Except in that drop which it sucked from thee, yet thou triumphst, and sayest that thou find'st not thyself nor me the weaker now. 'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honor, when thou yield'st to me, will waste this flea's death, took life from thee. Pardon me, I am once again under the weather. I saw my niece again for the Super Bowl, and she's a little bag of germs. And, well, here I am, sick again. The next poem comes to us from Charles Bukowski. It is titled, very romantically, Love Poem to a Stripper. 50 years ago, I watched the girls shake it and strip at the Burbank and the Follies, and it was very sad and very dramatic as the light turned from green to purple to pink, and the music was loud and vibrant. Now I sit here tonight smoking and listening to classical music, but I still remember some of their names: Darlene, Candy, Jeanette, and Rosalie. Rosalie was the best. She knew how. And we twisted in our seats and made sounds as Rosalie brought magic to the lonely so long ago. Now, Rosalie, either so very old or so quiet under the earth, this is the pimple-faced kid who lied about his age just to watch you. You were good, Rosalie, in 1935. Good enough to remember now when the light is yellow and the nights are slow. Bukowski and Love Poem to a Stripper. It doesn't get much better than that, I don't suppose. It doesn't get much more romantic than that, I don't suppose. If there is such a thing as love, Bukowski and his strippers shared it. The next poem, Paul's Wife, from Robert Frost. To drive Paul out of any lumber camp, all that was needed was to say to him, "How is the wife, Paul?" And he'd disappear. Some said it was because he had no wife, and hated to be twitted on the subject. Others, because he'd come within a day or so of having one, and then been jilted. Others, because he'd had one once, a good one, who'd run away with someone else and left him. And others still because he had one now. He only had to be reminded of. He was all duty to her in a minute. He had to run right off and look her up, as if to say, "That's so. How is my wife? I hope she isn't getting into any mischief." No one was anxious to get rid of Paul. He'd been the hero of the mountain camps ever since, just to show them, he had slipped the bark of a whole tamarack off whole, as clean as boys do off a willow twig, to make a willow whistle on a Sunday. In April, by subsiding meadow brooks, they seemed to ask him just to see him go. "How's the wife, Paul?" And he always went. He never stopped to murder anyone who asked the question. He just disappeared. Nobody knew in what direction, although it wasn't usually long, before they heard him in some new camp. The same Paul at the same old feats of logging. The question everywhere was, why should Paul object to being asked a civil question? A man you could say almost anything to, short of a fighting word. You have the answers, and there was one more not so fair to Paul, that Paul had married a wife not his equal. Paul was ashamed of her. To match a hero, she would have to be a heroine, instead of which she was some half-breed squaw. But if the story Murphy told was true, she wasn't anything to be ashamed of. You know, Paul could do wonders. Everybody's heard how he thrashed the horses on a load that wouldn't budge until they simply stretched their rawhide harness from the load to camp. Paul told the boss the load would be all right. "The sun will bring your load in." And it did, by shrinking the rawhide to natural length. That's what is called a stretcher. But I guess the one about his jumping so's to land with both feet at once against the ceiling and then land safely right upside again, back on the floor, is in fact, or pretty near a fact. Well, this is such a yarn. Paul sawed his wife out of a white pig log. Murphy was there, and, as you might say, saw the lady born. Paul worked at anything in lumbering. He'd been hard at it taking boards away for, I forget, the last ambitious sawyer, to want to find out if he couldn't pile. Pardon me. The lumber on Paul till Paul begged for mercy. They'd slice the first slab off a big butt log, and the sawyer had slammed the carriage back to slam end on again against the saw teeth. To judge them by the way they caught themselves when they saw what had happened to the log, they must have had a guilty expectation. Something was going to go with their slam banging. Something had left the broad black streak of grease on the new wood the whole length of the log, except perhaps a foot at either end. But when Paul put his finger in the grease, it wasn't grease at all, but a long slot. The log was hollow. They were sawing pine. First time I ever saw a hollow pine. That comes of having Paul around the place. Take it to hell for me, the sawyer said. Everyone had to have a look at it and tell Paul what he ought to do about it. They treated it as his. You take the jackknife and spread the opening, as you've got a dugout, all dug out to go a fishing in. To Paul, the hollow looked too sound and clean and empty ever to have housed birds or beasts or bees. There was no entrance for them to get in by. It looked to him like some new kind of hollow. He thought he'd better take his jackknife to. So after work that evening he came back and let enough light into it by cutting to see if it was empty. He made out in there a slender length of pith, or was it pith? It might have been the skin of snake had cast and left stood up on the end inside the tree. The hundred years the tree must have been growing, more cutting, and he had this in both hands, and looking from it to the pond nearby, Paul wondered how it would respond to water. Not a breeze stirred, but just the breath of air. He made in walking slowly to the beach, blew it off once with his hands and almost broke it. He laid it at the edge where it could drink, and at the first drink it rustled and grew limp, and at the next drink it grew invisible. Paul dragged the shallows for it with his fingers and thought it must have melted. It was gone. And then beyond the open water, dim with midges, where the log drive lay pressed against the boom, it slowly rose a girl, her wet hair heavy on her like a helmet, who, leaning on a log, looked back at Paul, and then made Paul in turn look back to see if it was anyone behind him that she was looking at instead of him. Murphy had been there watching all the time, but from a shed where neither of them could see him. There was a moment of suspense in birth when the girl seemed too waterlogged to live before she caught her breath with a gasp and laughed. Then she climbed slowly to her feet and walked off talking to herself or Paul across the logs like backs of alligators, Paul taking after her around the pond. Next evening, Murphy, with some other fellows, got drunk and tracked the pair up Catamount, from the bare top of which there is a view to other hills across a kettle valley. And there, well after dark, let Murphy tell it, they saw Paul and his creature keeping house. It was the only glimpse that anyone has had of Paul and her since Murphy saw them falling in love across the Twilight Mill Pond. More than a mile across the wilderness, they sat together halfway up a cliff in a small niche let into it, the girl brightly as if a star played on the place, Paul darkly like her shadow. All the light was from the girl herself, though not from a star, as was apparent from what happened next. All those great ruffians put their throats together and let out a loud yell, and threw a bottle, as a brute tribute of respect to beauty. Of course, the bottle fell short by a mile, but the shout reached the girl and put her light out. She went out like a firefly, and that was all. So there were witnesses to Paul was married, and not to anyone to be ashamed of. Everyone had been wrong in judging Paul. Murphy told me Paul put on all those airs about his wife to keep her to himself. Paul was what's called a terrible possessor. Owning a wife with him meant owning her. She wasn't anybody else's business. either to praise her or so much as name her, and he'd thank people not to think of her. Murphy's idea was that a man like Paul wouldn't be spoken to about a wife in any way the world knew how to speak. From Robert Frost in New Hampshire. That is an interesting poem to me because it includes a lot about myth building. It includes a lot about hero worship. It includes some of what does it take what does it take to be someone's equal? What does it take to make someone yours? We have the sort of idea that Paul was a terrible possessor, that he was basically the jealous type. But I don't know that we really have any reason to believe that, even if Murphy, in his assessment, was not only correct but honest. Murphy says he saw this all take place, and if that is true, even from this story, we have no real reason to believe that Paul is the quote unquote terrible possessor. We have but one love poem left, and it comes to us from Emily Dickinson. Poem 521. Endow the living with the tears you squandered on the dead, and they were men and women now around your fireside. Instead of passive creatures, denied the cherishing till they the cherishing deny, with death's ethereal scorn. Maybe not your traditional love poem, maybe not a lovey-dovey poem at all, but still, it's from Emily Dickinson, and you will love it. That's all I have for this stream. This was 5 love poems for Valentine's Day, and love still not real.